This video is sponsored by DistroKid. Most mixers make a big mistake when reaching for an EQ. Not because of what they're doing, but actually because of what they're not. They're ignoring Midside EQ, a game-changing tool for not only fixing tonal imbalances, but also sculpting the stereo image of a track with precision. Unlike traditional stereo EQ, which treats the left and right channels equally, MSEQ allows you to manipulate the center or mid and sides of a stereo signal independently, giving you more control over the focus and width of your mix. The mid channel is essentially the sum of the left and right channels, representing the center information. In other words, it contains the elements that are common or the same across both the left and right sides. The side channel, however, is the opposite, being the difference between the left and right channels, which represents the stereo width. In other words, it's where the information that's unique to each side lives, like subtle panning differences or distinct instruments panned hard left or hard right. But what does MSEQ really mean for your mixes? It lets you fully harness the stereo field, sculpting your stereo image with precision beyond just basic panning and volume adjustments, all while shaping the tone just as you would with a traditional EQ. Just imagine clear upfront vocals, more detail in the mid-range, and a low end that's both powerful and tight. All of this is possible with MSEQ, and I'm going to show you how in this video. I specifically want to highlight 3 MSEQ strategies that I incorporate into all my mixes. Moves that span drums and low end, vocals, and mastering to achieve professional sounding results. I'm going to be showing you specific examples, before and after comparisons, and practical tips you can use immediately on your next mix. And to up the ante, I'll even use 3 different MSEQ plugins to show you what's possible no matter which EQ you have at your disposal. And if you're looking for a solid MSEQ, by the way, I'll leave links to all the ones I use in this video down in the description below for you to check out. So stick around to see how you can implement MSEQ into your mixes to sound better and take advantage of this often overlooked process in mixing. But before we discuss the first strategy, let's talk about the sponsor of today's video, DistroKid. With their user-friendly distribution platform available on desktop and mobile, getting your music onto all the major streaming services is easy. But they do more than just distribute your music to stores faster than other distributors. They also give you access to useful tools and features like Instant Share. Whether it's hefty audio files, album artwork, or important documents, DistroKid members can securely store and share up to 1 GB worth of files for free. I often use it to send mixes and instructional videos like this one to clients, and honestly just about anything else that's too big to send as an email attachment. It's super simple to use, but let me show you how it works. Sign up for DistroKid if you haven't already, or log into your account. Upload your files, customize your settings including the password and self-destruct timer, and then copy, paste, and send your file link wherever you please. It's that simple. Get access to Instant Share today by signing up for DistroKid. You can save 7% off your first year by using my link down in the description below. Thank you to DistroKid for sponsoring this video, and now back to the content. Let's start with a technique that I find particularly useful for managing low end, which is using MSEQ to tighten up the low end specifically. To do this, we can apply a low cut filter to the side component of a stereo signal to reduce the presence of low frequency information within the sides specifically. By applying a low cut filter to the side channel, we can focus the low end into the mid, creating a stable central low frequency foundation that sounds clearer, translates better, and anchors the mix as a whole. The reason why we do this is because low frequencies tend to be omnidirectional. When present in both the mid and side channels, they can interact in ways that creates muddiness and a less focused low end as a whole. The issue is compounded by the fact that humans also have a reduced ability to pinpoint the direction of low frequencies. For example, solo a bass track in one of your own mixes, pan it hard left and take a listen. You'll notice how weird it not only sounds but also feels. Sure, you can still hear the bass, but it'll feel disconnected, less impactful, and overall unpleasant. And if you're playing it on a set of speakers, you'll probably even have a hard time fully discerning exactly where it's coming from despite knowing that it's on the left side, further proving my point. That being said, let's take a look at this example here. I'm going to specifically be using the Waves F6 for this, but of course what I'm going to show you is going to apply to any MSEQ you use. Now, a quick reminder, because mid-side processing affects the stereo field, you need a stereo signal in order to actually make this work, which is what I'm working with here, being a drum group consisting of a stereo signal or a left and right channel. That means mid-side processing isn't going to work if you're dealing with mono tracks only. So let's specifically take a look at this drum group on this drill hip-hop track specifically, which often has a lot of low-end buildup, especially from the kick, for example, and can really benefit from this technique and create an overall tighter sound. I've already got the F6 set up here, and I'll quickly play a moment so you have an idea of what this sounds like before we begin. So that sounds pretty straightforward so far. Now to begin this process, I want to actually go to the low cut filter that's a part of this EQ. I want to enable it. And instead of using this in a traditional mode, as I mentioned, I want to switch to the sides only. So what's going to happen is we're going to be removing the sides information on the low end with this low cut. Now I also want to solo the frequency so I can hear exactly what we're removing. From here, I'm going to play the track and sweep the filter to the right. Now the goal of this process is to actually remove as little as possible. Essentially, I want to make sure that whatever we're losing is not impactful or not important to the sound of the drum group, especially since I'm affecting multiple sounds that are going here. Chances are this will just sound like faint rumbling or just light information, nothing that's too loud or too present. However, if I notice as I sweep this to the right that I'm hearing a lot more of important sounds like snares or percussion, or maybe even the articulation of a kick drum, for example, then I'm going to want to back up and not remove as much. I typically find that we're going to set this somewhere between 1 to 200 hertz, at least for the sides, of course, but this is always going to vary depending on your track. So let's try this right now. I'm going to reset it down to the bottom here, play, and we can see exactly where we end up. So it's a pretty interesting difference, but notice how when I push the filter further towards 200, 300 hertz in solo mode, I was starting to hear more of the snare and other elements coming in, and the low end presence of those elements ultimately being removed. To be honest, this was just a bit too drastic. I actually didn't want to affect the snare, for example, or really any of those sounds that are present in the low end so drastically. As I mentioned earlier, my goal is really just to subtly tighten the sound up. We're not removing an excessive amount of low end. We're really just doing what we can get away with without anybody fully noticing. So basically, once I really pushed it up to that point and I heard that difference, I pulled back and I compensated and I didn't remove as much, which ultimately results in a more transparent or natural sound. And notice how in particular, how the elements that typically dominate the low end, like the kick, for example, weren't really audible here in the sides anyways. If I were to be applying this to the mid, however, you would hear a much more drastic difference. For example, if I switch to mid and solo the frequency, pay attention to what exactly we're hearing now. Right? We're hearing all of that low end information from the kick, and that's something that we don't want to remove in this case. We need that low end to be focused and centered, and that's why we're doing this move in the first place. However, in the sides, we don't necessarily need that information as much. And it is worth noting, if you find that this move is a bit too exaggerated or drastic for you, you can instead use a low shelf. Applying it in a very similar way, but obviously because it's a shelf, it's not going to be as drastic. Just once again, focusing it into the sides. And this may produce a smoother reaction that's a little bit less noticeable, again, if you feel like this is too heavy-handed, and this should ultimately just sound more gradual and transparent in comparison. But hopefully you can hear just from this brief example how it makes the drums a little bit more pointed, a little bit more sharp or distinct, and almost gives you this illusion that there's a bit of a bump in high-end presence and clarity at the same time. But let's shift gears now and talk about the second MSEQ strategy I want to share with you, which is controlling center focus. Instruments like the kick, snare, lead vocal, bass, and other key harmonic or melodic elements often live in the center for focus and crucial mono compatibility, ensuring they translate consistently across all playback systems. However, secondary instruments can sometimes interfere with these centered elements, reducing their clarity and even making the mix sound washed out at times. Therefore, to give these essential instruments the space they need in the mix and prevent this, we can use MSEQ with dynamic bands on competing instruments to reduce their mid-channel content, ensuring the most important sounds stay clear and upfront. I'm going to be using the FabFilter Pro Q4 for this example, and I'll specifically be using the dynamic modes, which which will translate into other environments. However, there are some interesting new features with the Pro Q that I also will show you, and I will talk about one in particular that I'm not going to use that is worth checking out after this demonstration. That being said, I got the Pro Q situated on my main vocal here, and I also have another instance on the competing sounds, which is going to be my all instrument master, which is the group with all of my instrument sounds that are ultimately clashing in the same area. Now, if I go back into the EQ on my lead vocal in particular, and I open up the instance list, I can see both of these EQ instances being my master here, my all instrument group, and my vocal. Now, if I play this, let's pay attention and see if there's any frequency overlap that's taking place between these two sounds, which will be highlighted in red. This is called a frequency collision on FabFilter's side, and it ultimately makes identifying this really easy. That being said, if you don't have access to the Pro Q4, what you may want to do instead is go into your vocal, use an EQ that has a solo frequency function, play and sweep around, and try to figure out where is the vocal most dominant, most intelligible. Where do you really want it to dominate and not be clashed with, right? What frequency area do you want it to be the most dominant element in? And then use that in the coming steps that we're going to talk about. That being said, I'm going to take advantage of the features that the FabFilter Pro Q4 has. So I'm going to play this and let's look out for any frequency collision taking place.
There's some logos around. We don't know if you're here. I'll let you watch. There's some logos around. We don't know if you're here. I'll let you watch.
So we can obviously see there was some frequency collision taking place between these two sounds from about 286 hertz upwards of 569 hertz. I've put these two nodes in just as a marker. We're not necessarily doing anything with them, but I'm just using this to gauge how wide do I need this reaction or reduction to be in the coming steps. That being said, we're going to close this instance for a moment. And before we proceed, I want to make sure that the dominant element has a bus or a send that's coming out of it to trigger the dynamic processes we're about to set up. So in my case, this lead already has a main Vox sidechain, as you can tell. And this is ultimately going to be used to trigger a reduction in the coming steps, as I mentioned. That being said, I'm now going to scroll up to the secondary sound, the sound that I want the vocal to take precedence on. And I'm now going to open up the Pro Q that is on my all instrument master. And I want to set it to receive signal from that sidechain that I created, this main Vox sidechain. And then I'm going to just create a band in between these 2 points. Now, this is where we're going to add a little bit of that MSEQ stuff that I was talking about before. So right now you see the band is set to stereo. I'm going to click it and change it to mid. So now this is only going to affect the mid channel, which is where the vocal is most focused. And therefore the side information is not going to be as affected. Now, to make sure that I'm setting this up correctly, I'm actually going to create a static reduction at first, just so I can really dial in the width here with the Q. And of course I need it to be as wide as these two markings that we set up in the previous instance list. So I'm going to just drive the Q up, and now you can see that it's roughly as wide as these 2 points and should really be focused on that area where the masking was taking place. From here, I'm going to now undo this reduction. I don't want to actually remove any of this. I want this to be a dynamic process, and that allows it to sound more transparent. It's not going to reduce a frequency perpetually the entire time. It'll only reduce it when the vocal and these instruments are playing simultaneously, and that'll allow those instruments to breathe and not be affected when the vocal isn't being performed throughout the arrangement, for example. So to make this dynamic, I need to right click and choose make dynamic, and now it is a dynamic band. Now you can see the range has started to populate, and this range is basically the maximum reduction, how much we can lose at most regardless of the setting. So even if I set this up to lose -5, -10, whatever, it's going to cap out here at just below -1. But to be fair, that's not that much, so I'm actually going to want to extend this a little bit further, and I'm going to set it up to go down to -3 in this particular example. Now the actual range amount that you should use is definitely going to depend. I find 2 to 3 is usually pretty optimal for most people, but of course if there's a lot of clashing going on in your mix, it might need to be set a little bit lower, or if there's not as much and it's pretty noticeable, you might actually need to have it be set a little bit higher, closer to -1, for example. That being said, I'm going to roll with -3. So with that being said, we now need to make sure this band knows to react to the key trigger and not to the actual material being fed into it itself. So not reacting to the instruments and the presence of the frequency within those instruments, but rather this overlap with this other sound. So to do that, I'm going to have to open up this other menu and select the external sidechain button, which is now going to say, hey, every time you see this sound playing at the same time, react and turn this band down. If it's not coming through and not playing, this band is going to be left untouched. We're also going to see the level of this band here on the threshold. In saying that, what we now want to do is play the track and bring the threshold down so that way the vocal signal that we're seeing passes it and causes the reaction to happen. Let's do that first.
There's some logos around. We don't know if you're here. I'll let you watch. There's some logos around. We don't know if you're here. I'll let
That seems to be pretty good, but now we can tailor this reaction a little bit better using the attack and release settings that are now equipped on the Pro Q4. I'm actually going to bump both of these up to the fastest setting, so the fastest attack and the fastest release. This is basically going to dictate how fast the reaction happens, how quickly it reduces the presence of these frequencies, and also how quickly it lets go and lets those frequencies go back to their unreduced state, let's say. Chances are we're going to want to leave the attack to be pretty quick so that way the vocal punches through right when it happens, but we may want to adjust the release to smooth things out a little bit, probably slowing it down a little. We're going to try some things and see what works. Here we go.
There's some love who's around. We don't know if you're here. I'll let you watch. There's some love who's around. We don't know if you're here. I'll let you watch. There's some love who's around. We don't know if you're here. I'll let you watch. There's some love who's around. We don't know if you're here. I'll let you watch.
And there you have it. You can hear how much more clear and upfront the vocal is and how much it's no longer clashing with these other sounds. There's a clear priority of the vocal in the mid channel here, which is really where it's focused once again. And just for example's sake, let me actually create another band that's focused onto the sides, and I'm going to show you exactly what's not being affected. So right now the mid around 400 hertz is being reduced, but if I were to take the side band and do the exact same thing, and now if I solo this band, pay attention to what's existing in the sides, and I'll do the same comparison with the mid so you could see exactly what's being affected versus what isn't. So it's pretty interesting, right? We have the same frequency content, right? The same frequency ultimately being manipulated, at least in the mid band. And you can hear how there's a fairly even distribution in the mid and side channels. Therefore, by reducing it in the mid, even though that might be destructive to some, it's reducing the presence. We're ultimately doing it to prioritize the vocal. And because these sounds are ultimately present in the sides as well, the impact of it is not that drastic. And as a bonus, if I felt like this was really starting to ruin the quality of these sounds, I could always go in and actually boost the sides here in the same sort of fashion. Let's actually do a quick experiment and see what that sounds like.
There's some love who's around. We don't know if you're here. I'll let you watch. There's some love who's around. We don't know if you're here. I'll let you watch. There's some love who's around. We don't know if you're here. I'll let you watch. There's some love who's around. We don't know if you're here. I'll let you watch.
Pretty cool, right? Allowing us to obviously get a boost or a bump, an increase in presence, but specifically in the sides, while still prioritizing the vocal and controlling that center focus, as is the point of this whole strategy. Now, I specifically, of course, use a dynamic band in this case, but as I mentioned earlier, the FabFilter Pro Q has a couple of new features that are worth exploring as well that I purposely avoided so that way this strategy can be implemented no matter what EQ you're using. But that new feature is spectral dynamics. This is almost like Soothe 2 or a lot of these other smart EQ plugins that'll automatically detect resonances and react to them in real time. FabFilter Pro Q4 has the same functionality built in, and it's one of my favorite features to use to treat frequency masking in particular. So if you want to see a video where I actually show you how to do exactly what I just did, but using that spectral dynamics feature in particular, I'm going to leave a video up in the top corner of the screen and in the description below for you to check that out. But now let's talk about the third strategy that I frequently use with MSEQ, and that is to widen the stereo image of a track, group, or even the entire master. This process is honestly really simple but effective at the same time. Essentially, we're going to boost a specific frequency range in the sides of our track, which increases their presence and enhances the width and spaciousness of the mix in that area. This technique works especially well for widening sounds in the upper ranges, such as guitars, pads, or pianos, allowing them to stand out more in the stereo field without increasing increasing their presence in the mid channel and causing interference. Since the previous examples focused on groups and individual tracks, let's apply this technique to a master for this demonstration. Now I've got my master here, but I'm going to switch it up once again and use the Dangerous Music Bax EQ for this process. For those unaware, a Baxandall EQ, or a Bax EQ for short, is a special type of shelving EQ with a wide and gentle Q factor. This basically makes them some of the smoothest sounding EQs out there, which is ideal for mastering situations specifically like this one. So let's try it out here. And the first thing we want to do here is, right now this is working in stereo mode with a left and right channel and they're linked. I'm actually going to enable MS mode. So now the top is the mid frequency and the bottom is the side frequency. And I'm going to take off link. So that way we're only affecting the sides in this case. From there, I'm now going to play the track and then increase the high frequency gain, which caps out at plus 5 dB. And I'm also going to sweep through the frequencies to find the best or most appropriate one, which goes as low as 1.6K all the way up to 18 kilohertz. So let me reset this and let's try.
Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no paparazzi. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no paparazzi. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no paparazzi. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no paparazzi.
So it's a pretty interesting yet subtle difference at the same time. You obviously could tell that I swept through all of the frequencies here, trying to listen to the tonal differences that it's producing in the side channel. And I even had this boosted a little bit more before walking back on it and settling on where I am now, which is a roughly 1.5 dB boost at 7.1K. Again, we're focused on a master here, so I don't want to go too crazy heavy-handed here, and 1.5 even could be a little bit heavy-handed depending on your perception. That being said, you could tell that when I was going lower into these lower frequency areas, we're getting a little bit more of that vocal presence coming up, and not necessarily in a good way. Whereas when I was higher up, 7.1 and 18 in particular, those two felt best for me. If I wanted this to be a little bit more subtle, I probably would have went for the 18 setting, but overall I thought lifting around 7.1K and above felt best for my situation here. You could really hear that fullness of the track coming up in particular. It feels wider, feels more expansive, and the biggest difference actually happens when I take it out. When I take it out, you can tell that it's really losing something. And if you are concerned about loudness, the beauty of this Bax EQ as well is there is an output, so I can always walk back on this a little bit to better gain match things. But overall, I like the perception that we're getting. It is creating that wider sound, which is the whole point of this strategy, and it's sweetening the sound of the mix as a whole in a pleasing way. Now, these are 3 MSEQ strategies that I use on pretty much all of my mixes, but of course, there's more that I missed. For that reason, if you have any MSEQ strategies that you think are worth sharing, feel free to leave them down in the comments below to help me and your fellow mixers out there. And while MSEQ is powerful, it's not the only overlooked tool in mixing, I'd say. In fact, there's a few others that I talk about in this video that I'm going to leave on screen for you to watch next. If you got value out of the video, please smash that like button, and of course subscribe if you're new to see more mixing content like this in the future. I appreciate y'all for watching and look forward to helping y'all again soon. Peace.
5